Hello everyone, Professor Cruzlick here. So I wanted to make a video talking about the Bryan Caplan, the myth of the rational voter, especially the first few chapters where he lays out his arguments of the paper, his kind of unorthodox way of looking at electoral politics, of looking at democracy, maybe a little bit different than some of the other readings we've completed, and certainly some of the other readings that we will get to throughout the semester. So we'll talk about the myth of the rational voter and really connect it to this study of electoral politics. So his central theme of the book is kind of stark. Democracies oftentimes select poor policies, not primarily because of institutional design flaws or elite manipulation, as some other scholars argue, but instead because ordinary voters themselves hold mistaken and kind of systematically biased beliefs about how the economy works, how public policy works. So this is actually a pretty provocative challenge to the conventional wisdom in political science, and maybe that some of the other pieces that we'll read about will certainly contradict this understanding, but it's a pretty provocative challenge to this conventional wisdom in political science, which has long assumed that the preferences expressed through elections, although they're imperfect, they generally aggregate into a reasonable approximately of what the public interest is. Caplan kind of challenges this view and pushes back, and even in his introduction, in his preface, he writes about how these views that I'm about to introduce might be kind of controversial. And if you go on YouTube and you watch some interviews, if you watch him give speeches, he talks about how he was kind of surprised that his book received such a positive feedback, because some of these views were so counter to what much of the political science literature says. So let's what I would like us to think about and consider throughout this video is kind of then how Caplan's framework kind of might reshape or does reshape our understanding of electoral politics. Specifically, how does rational ignorance, something that he brings up, rational ignorance, shape voter decision making? This idea of rational ignorance. How do systematic biases structure the incentives of academics and parties? And what are the implications for the quality of democratic policy outcomes? So kind of what he lays out at the forefront that he wants readers to take away. And again, he acknowledges that some of these beliefs might be counter to what others in political science say. So because of that, we don't necessarily have to agree with everything Caplan says, but instead we just have to understand, okay, what's this argument that the author is making? And then think about why, like what evidence did they bring in? Why is this counter to other political science literature? And so maybe we finished the book, we finished the reading, we finished this video, and we don't agree with them. And that's, sorry, my husky's hair is floating around. And that's okay. That's how social science and a lot of humanities research works. Like, authors bring their arguments to the forefront, and we hopefully evaluate their evidence and evaluate what they're arguing, and then we come to a conclusion. So one of the earliest concepts we encounter in Caplan's account is that of rational ignorance in chapter 1. Don's pretty famous argument in his Economic Theory of Democracy, which was published in 1954, argued that because the probability of any one individual vote being decisive is pretty small, citizens have little incentive to acquire extensive political knowledge. In this sense, ignorance is not coincidental but rational. So oftentimes in my American 100 level course, when we're talking about like why people vote, one thing that we discuss and bring up is this belief that people have that, oh, I'm just one person. What difference will my vote make? So we see that one of the reasons people don't vote more often, or maybe they don't turn out as much, is because they have this belief. And maybe at the national level, maybe there's some truth to that, but we can imagine the downsides. If everyone felt that way, then who would be voting? And we see at local elections, sometimes those are extremely close. Maybe 100 votes win, maybe 200 votes are the deciding factors. Very close elections at times. So when we apply all this to electoral politics, this has pretty big consequences. If voters have little incentives to invest in costly information, acquiring new information, we should not expect the electorate to be composed of highly informed individuals carefully weighing policy trade-offs. Instead, the argument goes, we should expect limited knowledge, reliance on heuristics. So heuristics is this idea that we think we know, we have these shortcuts in our head about how the world works, about how things work, and then we just rely on them. And susceptibility to simplified appeals, which that idea comes up in many of our readings in here, and we'll see that again. So Caplan argues that campaigns adapt accordingly. So rather than engaging in technocratic debates over monetary policy or regulatory design, candidates emphasize symbolic appeals, emotional resonance, or easily digestible slogans that the populace can understand. Electoral politics thus reflects not only voter preferences, but the underlying logic of rational ignorance that shapes how those preferences are formed and expressed. So Caplan brings up this idea of the miracle of aggregation. So defenders of democracy have long countered this relatively pessimistic view with what is sometimes termed the miracle of aggregation. The idea here is that even if individual voters are ignorant, their errors will be randomly distributed, canceling one another out. The minority of informed voters will thus effectively determine electoral outcomes, ensuring a baseline level of rationality in democratic decisions. So if you have even amounts of voters that maybe don't pay attention on the right and don't pay attention on the left, they will cancel each other out. And instead, the more informed, more engaged voters in the middle will actually be those that sway election. So, okay, we've heard that argument. But Caplan challenges this optimism. He argues that voters' errors are not random. They are systematic. Citizens are not coin flippers. They are human beings embedded in social contexts, drawing on common narratives, and oftentimes repeating the same mistakes. When errors are correlated rather than random, aggregation manifests rather than cancels them. So it magnifies the errors instead of canceling them out. So a different way of looking at this issue of aggregating votes. So in electoral politics then, this fundamentally alters candidates' incentives. If large blocks of voters consistently overestimate the harm of trade, because Caplan spends a lot of time talking about and thinking about trade, using trade as one of his case studies, or voters consistently misunderstand the nature of profit, or maybe even misunderstand the economic system as it is, then it is not politically rational for candidates to ignore these misconceptions. It is rational to instead cater to them. As a result, elections may systematically select policies that deviate from expert consensus, and that may even hurt long-term economic welfare. So elected officials, politicians, aren't doing what experts say or aren't following in the path towards policy that experts argue, but instead are realizing these systematic shortcomings exist with the electorate and then following those policies. And Caplan says this is a problem. This leads to permanent poor public policy making. So Caplan also argues in his second chapter, he argues that there are these 4 systematic biases that characterize mass publics. One is, he argues, is our anti-market bias. This is the tendency to underestimate the benefits of market processes and to view profit seeking as exploitative rather than socially beneficial. He says there's an anti-foreign bias, this suspicion that trade, immigration, and globalization inherently harm the domestic economy. He argues something called make-work bias, the belief that economic health is measured by employment rather than productivity, leading voters to support inefficient policies if they perceive as job-preserving. And a pessimistic bias, this inclination to believe that the economy is performing more poorly than it actually is, and that the future will be bleaker than the evidence suggests. We absolutely see this. Even if you don't perceive some of the others, we absolutely encounter in our daily lives this pessimistic bias. When people are asked about how they think the economy is doing or the trajectory of the economy, they are oftentimes, especially if their candidate, their political party of their choosing is not in office, they think it is worse. They think the economy is worse than it actually is. So each of these biases has direct electoral consequences. Politicians do not merely tolerate these biases, they kind of strategically mobilize them and utilize them. Campaigns are structured around narratives that affirm voters' misperceptions because corresponding or correcting them is both cognitively demanding and politically costly. Explaining comparative advantage requires nuance and patience, whereas promising to simply bring back jobs or stand up to foreign competitors requires only a soundbite. And we know, although Caplan wrote this book more than a decade ago, we know with the changing way that Americans and those in democracies around the world consume media, where sound bites that can now easily travel around social media have become even more common than when Caplan was writing his piece. So thus, electoral politics is not simply about competing preferences, but about competing over misperceptions of how the economy and how the political system works. The biases Caplan identifies function as really enduring features of the electoral landscape, shaping the menu of policies that candidates are willing to endorse. So in the third chapter, the last chapter we'll talk about, because really if you read the first few chapters of the book, you have a good understanding of his arguments. And so in chapter 3, Caplan presents his empirical evidence to support his claim of systematic biases. Drawing on the 1996 Survey of Americans and Economists on the economy, this survey asked both lay citizens and professional economists identical questions about trade, labor, markets, immigration, and other economic issues. The results demonstrate a profound divergence. Economists overwhelmingly favored free trade, recognized the long-term benefits of immigration, and correctly identified foreign aid as a pretty minuscule portion of the federal budget. Ordinary citizens, by contrast, favored protectionism, perceived immigration as primarily harmful, and vastly overestimated the scale of foreign aid expenditures. For electoral politics, this divergence matters enormously. Candidates seeking to maximize votes rather than policy accuracy are incentivized then to side with the public's misperceptions and misconceptions rather than the expert consensus. It is electorally rational then to oppose trade agreements, to frame immigrants as a threat, or to exaggerate fiscal crises, or even fiscal or economic concerns, even if these positions are analytically weak. In this way, the empirical evidence reinforces Caplan's claim that electoral politics is systematically biased. So let us consider several concrete ways that Caplan brings up where these biases manifest in electoral campaigns. So with his make work bias leads candidates to promise trade creation, oftentimes through policies that may actually reduce efficiencies, tariffs, subsidies, or public works framed not in terms of productivity, but employment numbers. His anti-foreign bias provides fertile ground for elected appeals centered on economic nationalism, from opposition to NAFTA in the 1990s to recent calls for tariffs on Chinese imports. This pessimistic bias makes it politically effective to describe the economy as in decline, even during periods of economic growth. And this is oftentimes backed up by other scholars as well, who, when they look at citizens, when they're asked, do you think we're in a recession? We see that people say yes a lot, even though economists and policymakers have very specific definitions of what a recession is. That's not met very often, but yet people think they're in a recession. It's this pessimistic bias. So this narrative of decline resonates more powerfully with voters than the reality of steady increments and improvement in the economy. So each of these examples demonstrates how electoral politics is structured not simply by institutional roles or elite strategies, but by the predictable patterns of voter misperceptions. Okay, so what are then the implications for democratic theory when it comes to this? That is a tongue twister today. So because of Caplan's arguments are far-reaching, this resonates, the implications, that's a tough one today, are far-reaching. If elections are systematically biased, then democratic outcomes may regularly deviate from policies that would maximize welfare or reflect expert consensus. This challenges a central assumption of democratic theory, that electoral competition reliably aligns public policy with the public interest. Caplan's analysis also raises normative questions. Should more authority be delegated to experts insulated from electoral pressures, or should democratic responsiveness be valued even when it leads to suboptimal policies? How should we think about the balance between democratic legitimacy and policy competence? For the study of electoral politics, these questions are central. They remind us that elections are not merely mechanisms for aggregating preferences, but complex social processes shaped by psychology, cognition, and systematic bias. Understanding electoral politics thus requires grappling not only with institutions and strategies, but also with the quality of the views of voters, of their voter beliefs. So we're starting to see why maybe some of these claims that Caplan is making are kind of surprising and kind of go counter to other pieces we read about democracy. So to conclude, Caplan's The Myth of the Rational Voter provides kind of a sobering perspective on electoral politics. Rational ignorance limits the incentives of citizens to acquire detailed knowledge. The miracle of aggregation cannot rescue democracy when errors are systematic rather than random. Biases, anti-market, anti-foreign, make-work, and pessimistic, shape both voter decision-making and the strategies of political candidates, how it impacts electoral politics. Survey evidence confirms the gap between expert consensus and public opinion, and electoral incentives push politicians to align with the latter. For scholars and students of electoral politics, Caplan's work forces us to confront a difficult tension. Elections remain the cornerstone of democratic legitimacy and really the bottom floor of citizens' engagement in a democracy. But the policies they generate may be persistently distorted by biased beliefs. The questions we are then left with is not simply whether democracy works, but how well it works, given the limitations of voters. So again, as I said at the outset, we don't necessarily have to agree with Caplan, but as we're reading it and we're looking through it, it does provide an alternative view of how to look at democracy and how to look at a market economy and our place in a democracy, and then how electoral politics is shaped by these beliefs. So even if we don't agree with Caplan and we disagree with Caplan, it is still an interesting perspective and helps us have a fuller understanding of electoral politics in the United States and in democracies. Okay, thank you for watching.